2 years ago, I made one of the biggest decisions of my life. I left everything I knew in Illinois and moved to California to be with the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. I was in love, and at the time, nothing else seemed to matter. I packed up my life and started a new chapter, eager to build a future with him. We were about to get married, and in those days leading up to the wedding, I was filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I had never been one to dwell too much on the details of money or assets, but I knew that his family was well off. His mom owned multiple properties, and I heard whispers about how he was going to inherit the family business one day. He'd always been the responsible, dependable one in the family, and I admired that. But 2 days before the wedding, something happened that took me by surprise. I was asked to sign a prenuptial agreement. The moment the document was put in front of me, I felt a rush of panic. I didn't fully understand the terms. I wasn't familiar with his financial situation, and I didn't even know how the prenup would affect me in the long run. I knew his mom had assets, but I had no idea what it all meant. However, one thing was clear: there was a lot of pressure surrounding the situation. I didn't want to seem like I was marrying him for his money. I wanted him to know that I loved him for who he was, not for his wealth. At the time, I didn't think about the potential consequences. I just wanted to prove that I wasn't after his fortune. Fast forward to the present, and it feels like the walls are slowly closing in around me. For the last 2 years, I've lived in a world where I've been expected to stay home and take care of things while he works. Initially, I didn't mind too much. I helped clean the rental properties that his mom owned, took care of his disabled mother when she needed help. It felt like the right thing to do, especially considering that he didn't want me to work. "We have all the money we need," he'd tell me. But as time passed, I started to realize that his reasoning didn't sit right with me. I didn't know it at the time, but the more I helped with his mom, took care of the house, and kept things running smoothly, the more my own sense of self-worth and financial independence started to disappear. It became increasingly clear that my role in this marriage wasn't to be an equal partner, but to remain a caretaker, someone. In fact, if I even so much as mentioned wanting to work, he needed me to be available at all times, especially for him. But now the situation has gotten even more complicated and frankly suffocating. His mom, who has always had a strong hold on his life, on the surface it sounds like a generous offer, but when I really think about it, it feels like yet another way for me to be tied down to a situation where I have no control. The worst part: she's demanded that I not be on the title of the house. And when I went back and reread the prenuptial agreement, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The terms were even worse than I remembered. According to the prenup, if we ever receive anything from his mom, it's explicitly stated that we can't use it to grow our marital estate. Anything she gifts us would never belong to both of us. As a couple, it would always belong solely to him. I felt a rush of panic and confusion. I don't want anything from his mom. I never did. I just wanted to build something with him, the two of us. I wanted to contribute, to have a sense of ownership in our life together. But he forbids me to work, claiming it would jeopardize his inheritance, which is apparently the most important thing in his life. If he ever did decide to go to work, his mom has made it clear that he would be written out of the will. It's like being trapped in a cycle of dependency where my personal aspirations and financial future don't. Now, as his mom prepares to close on this house in the next week, I find myself in a deep state of anxiety. I don't even want to live in this house, but I also feel trapped. What's even worse is the realization that if he were to inherit the family business and decide to leave me, I would have nothing. I would have no legal recourse, no financial security, and no say in what happens to my own future. I'm completely dependent on him, and he's given me no way out. The thought of it terrifies me. In a way, I feel like I'm living in a situation that borders on financial abuse. It's disguised as something else, something that seems benign on the surface, but the reality is that I'm being controlled. My dreams, my financial independence, my entire sense of self is being stripped away slowly, piece by piece. He doesn't care about my future. He only cares about his inheritance, his wealth, and keeping me locked into this life where I'm nothing more than an accessory to his success. I love him. I do. I want to be with him. But the longer I live in this situation, the more I feel like I'm losing myself. The love that brought me here in the first place is starting to fade, replaced by fear and uncertainty. I can't help but wonder if I made a terrible mistake signing that prenup, moving across the country, and giving up so much of my own independence for someone who now seems more concerned with money than with me. As I sit here thinking about what to do next, I realize I need advice. I don't even know where to turn, but I can't keep living like this. I feel trapped in a marriage where I have no financial security and no way out. His mom has control over everything, and it feels like I've become a pawn in their game. If anyone has any advice, I would be grateful. Right now, I'm just scared, confused, and uncertain about my future. And I don't know if I can continue living in a relationship. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions, an unsettling mix of dread, resentment, and confusion. I could barely breathe without thinking about what the future held. I kept replaying the same thoughts over and over in my mind. How did I get here? What happened to the woman I used to be, the one who believed in her own independence, who had dreams and ambitions outside of just being a wife? I couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped in a gilded cage. On the outside, everything looked perfect. A beautiful house, even though I wasn't on the title, a loving husband, at least he was kind to me most of the time, and the prospect of a future that seemed secure financially, except that it wasn't secure for me, not in the way I needed it to be. I started doing more research on financial independence, legal rights, and even what a woman could do in a marriage where prenups and inheritances were involved. I felt completely ignorant about everything. How had I allowed myself to sign that prenup? I hadn't understood the weight of it at the time, and now it felt like a chain wrapped tightly around my neck, impossible to break free from. I couldn't talk to him about it. Every time I tried, he brushed me off, insisting that I was worrying too much, that everything would be fine. He always had an answer, always had an excuse for why things were the way they were. But his explanations felt more like justifications, and I felt my frustration building with every conversation that led nowhere. The more I dug into the prenup, the more I realized how dire my situation truly was. If something were to happen to him, no claim to his family's wealth, no assets to my name, no career, nothing. The worst part, I had no way of contributing to anything we might build together, and his mom had effectively cemented herself. The financial stability I had imagined I would be part of felt like a dream that had slipped through my fingers. I started to feel small, less like a partner in a marriage and more like a dependent. And every time I took a step back and examined my life, I felt like I was slowly losing myself, losing the woman I used to be, the one who could stand on her own 2 feet. One afternoon, after another exhausting conversation with him about the house his mom was buying for us, which, mind you, I still didn't want to move into, I sat down on the couch, feeling completely drained. It hit me then this wasn't just about money or his mom's influence. This was about control. He was controlling my life. He was controlling my future. He had used his wealth. I wanted to scream, to lash out, and tell him everything I was feeling. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I knew he would make it about how I was being dramatic, how I was ungrateful. He'd say things like, and maybe on the surface that would be enough for some people, but it wasn't enough for me. Not anymore. That night after another dinner, where he spoke excitedly about the house his mom was purchasing, and how we would be set for life, I couldn't take it any longer. I stood up from the table, my voice shaking but resolute, and said, I can't keep living like this. I can't live in this house that isn't mine, doing all this work." His face froze, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. It was the first time I had spoken up about how I truly felt. And in that silence I realized that I had already been making plans in my mind, plans for what I could do if things didn't change. I wasn't sure what the next step would be, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "Are you saying you want to leave me?" he asked, his voice sharp. I didn't answer him immediately. I didn't know if I was ready to leave or if I could even bring myself to do that. But I knew that something had to shift. If it didn't, I would lose everything that was left of who I was. "I don't know," I replied. "I'm not saying I want to leave, I just—" He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "I'm doing this because I love you," he said softly. "I want to protect you, but if you want to work and mess up your inheritance—" That was the moment I realized something even harder to accept. He didn't see me as an equal partner in this relationship. To him I was a responsibility to protect, not a person with her own dreams and needs. I stayed up late that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The fear of being alone, the fear of losing him, the fear of making the wrong decision, it all swirled together, making it impossible to think clearly. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. I couldn't stay in this marriage if it meant losing myself. I had already been losing myself for 2 years, and I was finally starting to realize how far I'd gone. I spent the next few days trying to find a way to talk to him about my feelings without triggering his anger or frustration. I didn't want to be accusatory, but I needed him to understand that I couldn't continue living this way. And yet every time I approached the subject it felt like I was walking on eggshells. He would deflect, avoid, or tell me how much he was sacrificing for our future. But the truth was I didn't feel like I had a future of my own. Not in this marriage, not with these financial constraints, and not with the constant presence of his family's control hanging over us. I knew I had to make a choice, a hard choice, but I couldn't see a way out. Not yet. So I took the first step. I started making calls to financial advisors, seeking legal advice on what my rights were under the Prenup. I wanted to know what my options were. I wanted to know if I had any hope of building something for myself, something that didn't rely on him or his family's generosity. It felt like the smallest step, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of finding a way out of the suffocating situation I had found myself in. But for the first time in years I felt a flicker of hope. Even if I didn't know what the future held, I knew I had to start making decisions that were about me, about my future, about who I wanted to be. And whatever happened next, whether I stayed or left, I knew I would no longer be defined by the life I had built with him, but by the life I would create for myself. The days after that confrontation felt like an emotional battlefield. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man I once loved so deeply, but I also saw the walls he had built around us, the walls that kept me from having my own voice. The part of me that had been so consumed with love and devotion now wrestled with a feeling of betrayal. I couldn't help but wonder, had he always viewed me as something to be managed, something to be controlled? I kept replaying the conversation we'd had about the house, his inheritance, and my role in this marriage. His words echoed in my mind. "I want to protect you, but if you want to work and mess up your inheritance." It was clear that he wasn't seeing me as an equal. He wasn't seeing me as someone who deserved to have her own life. All I ever wanted was to build something together with him. But now I felt like an afterthought, someone who existed merely to complement his life. I had been so blind before, thinking that love would be enough. I had convinced myself that the sacrifices I was making would eventually lead to happiness. But now it felt like I had sacrificed everything: my career, my independence, my sense of self. I was too deep in the weeds to see how this could have been healthy or fair. So I decided to take more concrete action. No longer was I going to just sit back and hope things would change. I knew I had to make a decision that would impact my entire future. It was time to seek more professional guidance, to understand my rights, and to get clarity on what I could legally do to protect myself. The first step I took was calling a financial advisor. I needed to understand how I could regain control over my finances, how I could start building my own wealth separate from him and his family's assets. The financial advisor was kind, understanding, and very patient. She walked me through my options, and although it wasn't easy to hear, she told me things that I needed to know. You need to start separating yourself. If you're not careful, you could end up with nothing if anything happens, and that's not something anyone should risk, especially not in a marriage. Her words hit me like a cold bucket of water. I had been so emotionally wrapped up in the idea of being a loving wife, so focused on making my marriage work. But now, hearing it from an expert, I realized just how dangerous the situation had become. The next day, I called a lawyer to discuss my prenup. I needed to understand if there was any way to challenge it to modify it, or to at least make sure I was protected. The lawyer was empathetic, but also blunt. Prenups are difficult to contest, especially if you signed it willingly, she explained. But that doesn't mean you don't have options. If there is evidence of undue pressure or if you feel that the terms were unfair, we can look into that. I left that meeting feeling a mixture of relief and dread. There were options I hadn't even considered before. But the reality was that I was still tethered to this agreement, and the only way to free myself. The prospect of confrontation terrified me, but I knew I couldn't keep living in this emotional prison. I spent the next few days in a fog, reflecting on everything. It was hard to concentrate on much else, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down on me at all times. I kept thinking about how my life had unfolded over the past 2 years. Moving to California, leaving behind everything I knew, putting my trust in him, and slowly watching my dreams slip away in the process. I had wanted to be a supportive partner, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what was important for me. I didn't know who I was anymore. I couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when deep down I knew it wasn't. I didn't deserve to be in a relationship. I had to reclaim my life. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't a letter to him, but a letter to myself. A reminder of who I was, who I wanted to be, and what I needed to do. I wrote about how I had felt when I first moved here, the excitement, the love, the hope. I wrote about how I had sacrificed so much to try to build a life with him, only to find myself standing in a place where I didn't know who I was anymore. But I also wrote about the woman I wanted to become. I wrote about the strength I needed to tap into, the courage I needed to find, and the independence I had to reclaim. The letter was my declaration to myself that I was going to start taking the steps necessary to rebuild my life. The next day, I did something even harder. I sat down with him. I didn't know how this conversation was going to unfold, but I knew I had to tell him everything I had been feeling. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling as I sat down across from him. I tried to steady my nerves, but my heart was racing. "Of course," he replied, his tone light. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, "and I need you to listen to me, really listen, because this is hard for me to say. I don't feel like I have a future here. I don't feel like I'm part of a team with you anymore. I feel like I'm just here to serve a purpose in your life." He blinked, his expression shifting, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What do you mean? You know I love you. I'm doing all of this for us, for you." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You're doing it for you. You're doing it for your family. I'm not a part of this, and I don't have a future here, not the kind of future I want." There was a long silence, and I could see the weight of my words settling in. But then something unexpected happened. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time I saw a vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored my own fear. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "I don't want to lose myself," I replied, my voice breaking. I wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: it was the beginning of something. Whether we stayed together or not, I was starting to reclaim control over my life. I wasn't going to wait for someone else to give me permission to live it. And as we sat there, with a future that felt uncertain and fragile, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to take the first steps toward finding out who I was again, beyond the wife, beyond the caretaker, beyond the woman who had lost her own identity in the shadow of someone else's dreams. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, and I was ready to embrace it no matter where it led.